Hello and welcome to the Commonwealth Club. My name is Janine Zaccaria. I'm the Carlos Kelly McClatchy Lecturer in the Department of Communication at Stanford University, and I'll be your moderator this evening. Over the last 5 decades, we've seen the dramatic globalization of organized crime and corruption, now totaling trillions of dollars every year. This includes corrupt banks, law firms, elected officials, lobbyists, and criminal networks who are contributing to global inequality and the decline of democratic institutions around the world. In 2007, Drew Sullivan and Paul Radu founded OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Spanning 6 continents, OCCRP is a global network of more than 180 investigative journalists, researchers, data engineers, and security specialists who work tirelessly to expose crime and corruption with the highest degree of journalistic ethics and editorial standards. I'll be in conversation with Drew and Paul for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for audience questions. Drew and Paul, thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy.
What I want to do tonight is define the problem first, and then talk about your methods, sort of the more nuts and bolts of the organization and the journalism. But first, let's talk about this problem. Why, in your view, maybe we'll start with you, Drew, are we seeing such a growth in organized crime and corruption now in 2023?
You know, I think, Janine, that we're recognizing it in 2023, but really it's been growing for a long time. And it really started, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, when a tremendous amount of money was released from the East and came into the West. And this was really profoundly undemocratic money. And it was basically it connected with what we call the criminal services industry. Those are the banks, the lawyers, the registration agents who really helped move this money into the West. And this empowered organized crime, connecting them to a global market, giving them the kind of resources. They got into, the West at a time when, Google was booming and they made fortunes in the stock market. And so it created kind of an industry that's been just growing from there. And it's a very low-key industry, but it's got the same elements of capitalism and the industries that we know about. And so it's really been kind of just under the radar for many years. And we see it as a hedge fund with a lot of money, but behind it is really drug cartel money and money stolen from countries in the West and kleptocratic money. And it's been cleaned and it's been made. It's given a nice blue blood face to it, but it is criminal money that begets more criminality.
Paul, why do you think it's, besides the work that you're doing, why are we noticing it more now than?
I mean, it's really the awareness of people and the fact that a lot of crime has become more globalized in the past 3 decades. We're looking at crime from back in the 50s of the last century, 60s, and it slowly grew across continents, across the world. And it was really, organized crime is a product of the Cold War. And it leads us into the new Cold War, actually. So I think, there's more awareness of what's going on around the world, and the fact that we can connect the dots right now and see that the same group of people, who are hurting citizens in Mexico, these drug cartels from Mexico are hurting people in Europe and in Africa. It's the same groups. Decades ago, we would see these as separate kind of incidents. And now we see that there's a line connecting them because this is transcontinental organized crime. So that is a big change. That's a big difference that's made by the perception of what is going on. And by the fact that investigators, law enforcement sometimes, obviously journalists, can dig through public records and can connect, data from one continent to another to actually see the networks. And we actually learned a lot from the criminals at OCCRP. When we started OCCRP, we would be going to interview criminals who were convicted for various types of crimes. And we would always ask them, how and why? And one of the explanations that they always gave us was that their work was in the public interest. They always said,
the criminals said their work was in the public interest?
The criminals said that their work was in the public interest and that they were doing a favor to their victims. For instance, these were traffickers in persons. They were trafficking human beings, from one place to another, exploiting them. And they said, well, we actually took these people from these poor villages in Eastern Europe and gave them a chance in Paris or in Barcelona and all that. But they always worked across networks. These people were already organized in networks way before journalists. So this was their strength, and they talk freely about it because they knew at that time that their power is unmatched, that they had this sense of impunity, that because they're operating across frontiers, that they have no enemy, because the law enforcement was always stopping at the borders of a country. And these people were hopping borders without any problem.
I see. Just for the people who are not immersed in this, maybe we should just define dirty versus dark money. Can you do that, Drew?
So dark money really, I'm not sure of the orthodox definition of it, but the way that we see it is really dark money is intended to be hidden and transferred for another purpose. Dirty money is just, I made a lot of money in a corrupt method and I'm going to go launder it in New York and buy a nice big apartment. But dark money really has an intention of, either propagating criminality or influencing things.
Supporting a terrorist group, for example? Would that be dark? Okay.
Yeah. And so what we've actually seen is a lot of organized crime, and it's difficult, when we say organized crime, we often mean corrupt governments. So there are corrupt states that are really an ongoing criminal conspiracy for doing things for the purpose not of the state but for criminal gain, and so we consider them organized crime.
And that's your sweet spot? You guys are focused more on the state corruption than sort of these individuals,
combined.
Or both? Or they work with these bad actors?
They work with each other.
So if you look again back to the last century, to the 70s, 80s in Eastern Europe, what you see is that the socialist communist regimes in that part of the world, they weaponized organized crime. So what they did was, in order to undermine the West in various ways, they teamed up with traditional mafia groups from Italy. So there's a lot of lots of documents in the archives of these countries, in Bulgaria, in Romania, in Hungary, in Czech Republic, where you see the secret services, the state secret services, working hand in hand with the Italian mafias to organize these trafficking networks, sometimes smuggling people, sometimes trafficking cigarettes, narcotics, everything. So there was always this intersection between the state and the organized crime. With the fall of communism in '89, lots of these secret service agents who used to work for the state went private, and they started their own PMC, these private companies, and they started working for their own interests rather than the state. And this bond between organized crime and these people became even stronger, and they acquired lots of industrial assets at first in Eastern Europe, and then because they accumulated so much wealth, they were able to expand to the US, to Germany, and to many other places on Earth.
So one of the things that you say this whole phenomenon does is it furthers global inequality. Where do we see this most starkly?
Yeah, I think you're seeing it in places like Africa, where there's Africa is resource rich, and yet almost every single in so many countries, almost every single exploitable asset is being controlled, first through the government and then who they're actually selling it to, which could be through bribery to people who exploit it for profit, but often to people that they're connected with or to their political parties or their criminal groups. And so a lot of money that could be used to bring people out of poverty in these countries, is being exploited, and then the money goes to the West. So you have really high costs of money locally, which makes it even more difficult to get loans and for small businesses to start and for people to buy houses. And so you have an increasing impoverishment with high rates in those countries, while the money flowed to the West and it would go into accounts and be loaned back through banks. And we had too much money. We were gambling with money in the West. So it's created this skewed economic system that's bad for both places. And then they're sending billions over, and then we're sending millions back in aid to try to bring these countries out of poverty. They have everything they need, it's just all being stolen.
I want to talk about that, lack of enforcement, the enablers, the enabling role that I guess some of the banks play in a moment. Did you want to add to that, or was another question here?
Yeah, I was actually gonna add that there's this image that plays very vividly in my mind from time to time, and it's my first time in Kinshasa in the DRC in the Congo, and I've never seen anything like that. I mean, that's an immensely rich country with lots of resources, and you go and you walk on the main boulevard in Kinshasa, and you see so many sick people walking down the street.
A lot of dirt roads too, and
it's paludism. It's all sorts of sickness. I mean, you see them, and these are all treatable diseases, and you see that they're not treated, and they're in really, really bad shape. Lots of them. It's like unbelievable, and that's one example of a country that's looted to the bone, and people are suffering like big time.
Another thing that you argue and prove is that how all of this is leading to a decline in our democratic institutions and a rise of populism that we're seeing around the globe. What are some of the most startling examples of that? How can we make this concrete for people?
So the first thing to understand is that one of the things that organized crime seeks to do is really undermine law enforcement and undermine journalism and undermine the elements of the state that can really fight back against them. And so they do that with populists, and often those populists will attack law enforcement, they'll attack journalism, they'll attack kind of these tools. And so we've seen that this is all really about state capture. And there's been some examples of it played out in places like Hungary and now recently Slovakia and other places where you have really nasty criminal organizations running the state. And then they use this kind of populism to propagandize the people and to attack the people that were interested. And so that's really been the model. And once you capture the state, you undermine, elections, you undermine law enforcement. When the president of Serbia, as an example, became President Alexander Vučić, the first thing he did was fire the lead organized crime investigator in the country. And then he fired the judges who had been involved in a number of big cases, and then he started firing law enforcement people, and eventually he put in a head of law enforcement a police officer who had been fired because he was found hosing down a murder scene with a giant fire hose before the police investigators could get to it. That's somebody he could work with because they're corrupt. And so those are the kind of things you see in these states to basically make it impossible to prosecute and impossible to reelect these people. And then the media is bought out by friends of the organization. They lose advertising dollars from the state and from the phone companies and from these big things that typically fund media. And it's a playbook on undermining the state. And unfortunately, you even see some of these things going on in the United States, where media is getting bought out by people, where there's propaganda and there's, attacks against law enforcement and media, designed to undermine these kind of things. And that's the real concern.
So let's talk about, and I want to come back to the question of how bad it is here in the U.S. after, but let's talk about the enablers. So there are laws against some of these, I guess maybe not in these countries individually. Is that the problem? Or, is it the problem that the money's being hid in the West and the banks here are not incentivized to deal with it? They'll just pay the fine and it's too lucrative for them? Like, how do you explain the lack of enforcement of rules?
We did, for instance, last year a project that was focused on Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse was one of the largest and very respected banks in Swiss banks. So they had a big name, but when you look at their history over the past 15 years, 20 years, they kept on paying fines for not complying with due diligence policies, for not fulfilling their duties to check who their clients were. And they always, after paying each of the fines, they pretended, now we're clean, now we cleaned up our act. Well, guess what? Last year we found out that they have not cleaned up their act, and we exposed Credit Suisse again. And now
the 11th time, by the way.
Yeah, So this is really, I mean, these models are embedded with the business of the bank. So they know that the fines will never trump the profit. So then, you know, they count on paying the fines and going forward with the same business model, which is obviously not sustainable in the longer run. But this business model was very damaging to lots of emerging democracies around the world, because the moment people started the Arab Spring, for instance, you know, there was a lot of hope. Or, you know, 89 in Eastern Europe, a lot of hope. Everybody thought now communism is gone and, you know, a new era is starting, democracy, capitalism and all that. But the reality to that was that, in fact, the same people who were in power before, because they managed to deposit their money in the Swiss banks, US banks, EU banks, they were still factually in power. They were able to buy, you know, all the industries, everything that was up for grabs in those countries, because in those countries nobody could go for private business because they didn't know how to go about it.
So when Hosni Mubarak is ousted, or Ben Ali in Tunisia,
it does not matter.
The money's...
It does not
They can still access their money?
Yes.
They never froze it, you're saying?
Right.
Unless we expose it, and we were able to expose some of that money. You know, after the Arab Spring, for instance, we found out that the head of the Secret Service in Egypt, they had some money in Switzerland, and some of that money was frozen. But it's very little. I mean, I don't think we exposed the bulk of it, and the bulk of it is really what undermines democracy and what cuts hope when change happens.
And you know, a lot of this too is it happens outside of the country. It happens with offshores.
Yeah.
So if you have an offshore company, you can do a lot of things. You can trade with your company at a loss for your company, so that's essentially embezzlement. You can on December, when you've made $12 million, you can move it offshore in some kind of contract with this offshore company at a cost of $12 million. So now you've evaded taxes. It's this incredibly easy to use tool that people found. And once the money goes offshore, it's basically opaque, and law enforcement can't follow that across borders. And so that's what really happened is, you know, the offshore industry became huge. And if you look at places like Ukraine during, you know, the days of Yanukovych, who was the pro-Russian leader, the largest trade partners of Ukraine were Cyprus and the British Virgin Islands. You know, which is all offshore. You know,
and they're all tiny territories, you know, compared to Ukraine. So how can they be?
And they don't produce anything. None of them produce anything. So there's nothing to trade. So it was really, you know, this became almost every single business deal involved offshores, and that's how they really, you know, evaded. And then of course, you know, the lawyers and the others helped them get the money into hedge funds, and hedge funds in America are unregulated, and you can't find out who's got money in a hedge fund. And so consequently, you know, the system is set up to allow this money to be essentially laundered around the world, and for nobody to figure it out. And there is no world policeman, as Paul mentioned. And
Interpol or something?
And
that's a communications device. It's not a law enforcement agency.
If I may actually add to this, it's not just reactive. It's not just like some lawyers or accountants sitting there in their offices and waiting for the, you know, kleptocrat to come in to knock on their door. These people are actually proactive.
They're seeking it.
They're recruiting.
They're creating pipelines for massive, you know, fraud. And those pipelines include offshore type of companies, include banks, include proxies, formation agents. Everything is given as a package to these people. And then they organize meetings, just like these ones, you know, where they advertise their services to recruit people, you know, to use their pipelines, to launder money, to go about the theft, to go about the fraud. So these enablers are proactive. They're part of the crime, not just, you know, assistants to the crime.
They connect you. So if you need an American lobbyist, I'll introduce you to Paul Manafort. You know, it's a kind of system where they would connect everybody together. So every need that you have, you know, it gets covered because you've got billions of dollars now. You know, you're a whale. And they're going to get the money.
It's interesting. It's kind of like they're doing it out in the open.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what percent.
Legal.
We're not talking about crypto or anything where you try and hide it. You're saying they're pretending to do it this way, using Credit Suisse, lobbyists that are registered in the U.S. It's not a secret.
Look, years ago when you arrive into Riga, the Riga airport in Latvia, which is a country at the Baltic Sea, you could see, when you were waiting for your luggage on the band, you could see all these commercials, use our banking system, use our, offshore type of companies and so on. It was all in the open, right there.
So there was a recent UN report, I think, that estimated money laundering at $2 trillion per year.
Yeah.
Is that right? I think that the U.S. annual budget's about 6.5, so almost a third of the annual U.S. budget is money laundered.
Yeah.
It's an extraordinary number.
And abroad, it's worse. We actually looked at the amount of spending that governments do versus the amount of spending organized crime does. And in the United States, it's about 26 to 30 to 1. So government spends about $30 for every dollar of crime. But if you go into Mexico, it's 15 to 1. Mm-hmm. And the difference between 30 to 1 and 15 to 1 is the difference between a country that is ruled by law and one that is not, that is in chaos. Now you go into Eastern Europe, in Serbia, it's 6 to 1. If you go to Montenegro, it's 1 to 1. Now imagine organized crime having the same amount of money as a state. You cannot run a state with that kind of relationship. You've lost already.
I want to shift to some of the more spectacular you've done everything spectacular, but after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you published the Russian Asset Tracker, right? Which cataloged, I believe, $20 billion in foreign assets, more than $20 billion held by those close to Vladimir Putin. Talk about that investigation. What can you say about how you tracked it and what the impact was when you published it?
So we had a head start. We've been working Putin's inner circle for a long time. When nobody was really interested in this issue, we were writing story after story after story of where this money was going. So we knew a lot of where this money was. We knew a lot of the names of the yachts, the super yachts that were there. So, but it's fairly simple to do this, because once you figure out all these people have a proxy, and that proxy might be a family member, but it's often somebody associated with them. And once you figure out the proxies, you can start figuring out where the assets are. Because they register everything in the name, and they think while they're registering in that proxy will never be discovered. But we work hard on this. We get leaks, we get information, Panama Papers, Pandora Papers. The work we did on the laundromats eventually release some of these names, and then we're able to go and track down large amounts of assets. So it's old-fashioned follow the money journalism. We go through all our records. We request land records. We request airplane and yacht registrations, and just find those proxies.
And we do this zoom in and out between digital records and paper records. Mm-hmm. Because in many countries you still have to go paper, in order to find out if a property is owned by X or Y. And sometimes, so we actually have a side of OCCRP that's pure research. These are people who are very focused, and they know how to track down a company, how to track down a bank, how to track down property and all that. But sometimes when you do the field work, you come across amazing things. Like, I remember some of our reporters going to Spain near Madrid somewhere, and they found this villa, because we had these property records that showed that the villa was owned by a Russian oligarch. And they went there, and on that street there were some workers doing some work on the street, and our reporters asked the workers, do you know if this villa belongs to these people? And they said,
what time it is? I need a clock.
Actually, we're not quite aware of that, but these other two villas, they belong to this Russian and that Russian, which gave us another opportunity to get new records to prove that indeed, because these people tend to cluster together. So it's about understanding how they work, what kind of documents you can actually get, who are their proxies, who are their lawyers, and then you go from there, and once you pierce the system, you have a great entry point to understand what's going on and to expose more and more.
And thank God for their girlfriends and their daughters, because they post to Instagram, and we get the pictures, and we figure out what boat it is or what house it is, and you geocode it, and you figure out where the property is.
So what was the fallout of this when it came out? What kind of impact did you have?
So there was a lot of yachts that were seized right away. Unfortunately, these people are smart. They have American and they have, British lawyers, and the lawyers warn them that, the sanction laws allow them to have up to 50%, but if they go to 51%, it can be seized. And so a lot of these, even though they were, known to own this boat, they were appeared on it all the time, they said they owned the boat, it was 50% owned by somebody else, usually an offshore. And so they're now in a number of court battles around the world over these mansions and these boats. And they have a lot of very wealthy lawyers in the dark now fighting these, in small courts all over Europe, in places like Monaco. And Europe is surprisingly corrupt, and they will end up getting back many of these assets. And
also governments found out how expensive it is, to actually keep these yachts moored somewhere, and that's another problem, because a lot of taxpayers' money is used right now to just keep those yachts there, and it's not easy, because unless they're fully in the property of the state and they can be sold, to make some profit on that, it's actually an expense for the citizens. So it's a very complex issue.
You could see actually in 2014 when Russia first invaded Ukraine, the oligarchs started scattering their assets even back then. So a lot of the assets were changing ownership then, and then the ones that hadn't done it started doing it in the literally the weeks before the latest invasion.
So you had a kind of role in the first impeachment of President Trump. Is that right?
An indirect role, yeah.
Can you tell the story remind everybody who Lev Parnas is?
So Lev Parnas is a Ukrainian businessman who's been in the United States. He had another business partner. And we started looking at Rudolph Giuliani and his visits to Ukraine, where he was actively engaged in trying to get Ukraine to do something about Hunter Biden. But we found that he... And this is true of a lot of politicians. You can look at the Menendez case. They start having interests in some of these countries, and he started dealing with people who had very clear connections to organized crime. And so that's what the story was about. It was a simple story, didn't get a lot of attention, but basically, he was connected to organized crime. It was organized crime we knew. This was also described as business people or controversial businessmen, but they were known organized crime figures who had been in the old Ukrainian White Books, which was a registry of organized crime figures. And so that story ended up being cited 5 times by the whistleblower in that particular case.
So, yeah, you wanted to add on that, Paul, or we can move on to another?
No, if you look at the Giuliani case, that's not a singular case. There are, unfortunately, lots of U.S. former officials who worked with organized crime in Eastern Europe and assisted oligarchs in Eastern Europe, former heads of the FBI, former general attorneys, and people like this who just saw an opportunity to make money, and the people with money in Eastern Europe were the kleptocrats. So they worked for them, and that was very disconcerting for the local populations who saw, well, this big name comes here and says this crook is actually not corrupt, he's honest. And that was a big blow, actually, in many of these countries where these people were defended. And, sometimes, these people would just issue a form, a paper that would actually say, we looked very carefully at this corruption case, and these guys are just not guilty, although there were mountains of evidence. But because they came from this environment, former heads of the FBI, their word had a lot of weight.
Ambassadors, prime ministers, Gerhard Schroeder, Tony Blair, all these people have gone in and have dealt with people who are truly criminal. And they do this on purpose. They seek to have these relationships with people. It's a laundering operation. It's a reputation laundering operation. Mm-hmm. And so they hire these people to come in and show up and talk to them and appear in public. And it's just basically a way to launder them. So once you've stolen $2 or $3 billion, you don't really want to be known as a criminal anymore. You want to be known as a businessman. Mm-hmm. And people think that that people like Abramovich and others, they're all controversial Russian businessmen. But actually, many of these people are organized crime people. They were organized crime people. They stole from the state. They bribed public officials. In many cases, they killed people. The winners of the aluminum wars in Russia, over 250 aluminum company executives were murdered in Russia, in this process. So these people have now gotten rich. They're comfortable. They got the nice houses. They got the yacht, and they need to clean everything up. And that's what often these Western politicians do.
Yeah.
I want to ask one more question before we shift to some more of the journalism nuts and bolts. But we talked a lot about the banks, but in terms of another way for this laundering is through real estate. And you did an investigation that related, I think, to the recent coup in Gabon, right? Is that right? And where you showed how the ruling family had stashed the stolen money in a D.C. property. I lived in D.C. for 10 years, so I know about this Dictators Row that is, where they've all these African owned big mansions. But do we have any bad actors paying cash for housing in the Bay Area?
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
Yeah, you do. I can't specifically name them, and we're very interested in this topic because the Bay Area has some of the highest real estate, in the United States and in the world. And so when you have to launder $1 million, it's not that difficult. When you have to launder $1 billion and then park it, that's really difficult. And so you can't have, a $2 million home. You need a, $200 million home. Where
are you going to find it?
Exactly.
Here, Marin.
And you're going to find it here, and you're going to find it in New York. And so that's where a lot of stuff. There are buildings in New York that have $200 million apartments and are completely empty. You'll never see anybody going in and out of them because it's just money that's being parked. And the other place that they commonly park it is in farmland. And so a tremendous amount of farmland. At one point, our estimate was 1/3 of eastern Slovakia was owned by the Ndrangheta Mafia out of Italy. And they were using it for farm subsidy fraud. And so I would not be surprised if the Sinaloa Drug Cartel or other organizations own significant amount of real estate in the Central Valley and other places like that.
And we're trying right now to work together with Stanford, with Big Local, on a big property project to determine who's behind some of the California property in about 5 counties. The thing is, we exposed a lot of corruption in the property area in Florida, in New York, because it's easier there to work with databases compared to California, which is interesting. It's much easier to identify bad parties with property in Dade County, for instance, compared to here. So that's because here people were actually smarter, and they used more LLCs, offshore type of companies, to hide their names behind various other layers. I think it's still doable, and we'll do it, but it's much harder in California.
Yeah, you'll find offshores, and then you have to break the veil over the offshore, which sometimes you can do. We have a database system that's got about 4 billion entities related to organized crime and corruption. These are from leaks and from other sources of information that we've collected over the years in public records. And then we can use that to see if it was in Panama Papers or if it was in one of the other leaks. We've got more leaks than we can even process. Our limiting factor is we don't have enough money to pay Google to store all of our databases on the system. Our storage budget is $30,000 a month just to store our data. So this is the real problem. And there's really just not enough resources in journalism to do the kind of big data crunching that you need to do this, which is, Google is a wonderful organization. They got our database started, but now we've paid 5 times more than they gave us to build the database back and storage fees to them. So it's an issue we're trying to solve.
So you just said something startling to me, 2 things. One, that really, if you had more money, you could store more data and you could do more investigations, right? Yep. It's basically, you've got more leaks than you can process, which is like a journalist's dream, right? That doesn't happen every day. So how do you decide then how to prioritize what to focus on? Do you look at what is the most starkly criminal, impacts the most people, or the most doable?
So, if I may address this first, it's really we're usually building up on our previous reporting. So we want to deepen a topic as much as possible. So once we understand that this type of offshores from Belize, for instance, are used by criminal groups all over the world to own property, then we go for all the Belize companies, in all these places that are hot, California, let's say, Florida, the south of France, Australia, and so on and so on. And then we go for these type of projects that build on our previous experiences, because these are the ones that yield the most good for us. And these are the projects that are done in the public interest. Now, this being said, as Drew said, we can't really process all these data sets that we have, because it's not just about storing the data in the cloud. It's about computing power. It's about matching database against database. A database of people involved in politics in Eastern Europe against a property database in the US. All the US.
You need to somehow standardize across.
So this type of work is very difficult to do. Technically it's simple, but because the access to information is so poor, and you have to go county by county to get the data, and then you have to consolidate it, and by the time that you're done with it, everything changes, and so on. So there are many factors there that interfere with our work, but really the fact that tech companies don't help with this. Actually, as Drew said, we're paying a lot of money, and we refrain from ingesting certain data sets inside our systems because the cost is too high for us, and we can't.
They can't give
afford
you a
it.
journalist discount at Google?
We have tried every single human being we know.
Anybody work at
negotiated
Google
with
here?
them.
Talk about, so you guys are, it's interesting because you're kind of a hybrid, right? You're not a conventional New York Times media organization, right? You also work directly with some civil society groups. So talk about that kind of newish model. It's a little bit different.
Yeah, so we, the whole journalism industry is really in flux right now, and there's all sorts of hybrid organizations out there. Bellingcat is a great example. They were the ones who identified, who shot down MH17, that it was a Buk missile from the Russian side that did that. And they're an activist organization that does investigative reporting. You have TI, which Transparency International, which has investigators, but they're an activist organization. So what traditionally has happened is journalists refuse to work with activists. But in many places around the world, that's really a problem. It means nothing gets done. And so we said we need to work with activists, but we can't let them interfere with what we're doing on stories. So we created what's called the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, and that's where we do investigative stories, and then we share our methodology and our data, and we pass it over the wall to activists and allow them to use it, which traditionally journalists would not do. And there's some organizations that would say that's wrong, but we're working in Kazakhstan, and we're working in Tajikistan, and we're working in places where this stuff is not going to get done. And so we've invited them to use it, and then they do things like file suspicious wealth orders in the UK, or they file, Magnitsky filings.
Complaints.
And they've complaints. Individuals can file criminal charges in countries, and they've made our work 5 times more impactful than it would be by just us alone. And so that's real world change, and we think that's worth it in these countries where there really is no hope. And we've been able to get $10 billion returned to government coffers because of our work directly, and that's a 13,000% return on every dollar spent in OCCRP. That actually goes back to government. So if you want to raise money for governments, open OCCRP in your country, and you'll make money. And we think that's worth the trade-off.
So journalists are news organizations are notoriously competitive, and they don't tend to collaborate on things.
Right.
But you've managed to kind of facilitate you've managed to break through that taboo. Talk about how you did that.
First of all, there's so much work out there and so few investigative reporters that it doesn't make sense to compete in that way. Because there's just, stories up for grabs, and we're not touching them because we don't have, enough journalists. So what we realized a long time ago, more than 15 years ago, is that if you want to go against organized crime, if you want to expose them and corrupt politicians, everything goes across borders. You cannot do it without the local journalism, without local people who know how things work in their own country. So without breeding this space, this investigative space where you can exchange easily information across borders, you will never be able to expose a network, because you gotta have local information combined with this transcontinental information in order to create the picture. And this is the only way to serve the citizens in a meaningful way. Now, when Panama Papers started, that we were part of, there was resistance from big media in the U.S. to participate in such a collaboration, and that was interesting to me, because I was sure, this is in the best interest of the citizens, in the U.S. and everywhere. But there was this resistance because the journalists, the investigative reporters, were still considered themselves as lone wolves. They get a whistleblower and they work with the data, or they get a record and they run with it without sharing anything. But this created a huge problem, because you're cherry picking stories that sometimes just answer to your ego rather than answering the public interest. And secondly, it puts you in great danger, because this work across networks also ensures a higher degree of safety for the journalists.
Well, that's my next question. Leads perfectly. How do you protect the people that work at your organization and the journalists who are doing this?
Reporter by reporter, story by story. It really is. We spend a tremendous amount of time doing this. We have our own witness protection program where we can literally move reporters around the region and around countries to protect them. We have security people. We have 2 digital security people. I myself, as when I was a publisher and editor, I get involved in it directly. Paul gets involved in it directly, and we have meetings on almost a daily basis now, going over issues. And our process is a little different. What we do is we first investigate the threat. So people kill or they don't kill. If they kill, when do they kill? How do they kill? Why do they kill? Where do they kill? What is their modus operandi? And we literally report this to try to understand who it is we're dealing with, how dangerous they are, and what they're likely to do. And so we design a very specific set of protocols for a given story on safety, and we follow those protocols. And then, we train all our reporters in surveillance and counter surveillance so that they can identify when there's security, because when there's a security problem, because what we found out is when organized crime typically kills people, if it's not Mexico, they'll basically follow you anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks, and that may be the only indication that somebody is wishes you harm. And so consequently, we train our reporters to look for that surveillance and identify it, and they're taught in how to do, anti and counter surveillance. And so, we look for these types of things, and then we move people out. But we just had to,
What do you mean you move people out?
We'll move them out of the country if we've identified surveillance.
How often do you have to do that?
Almost twice a month. It's that bad. We just had to move our whole organization out of Kyrgyzstan. That we're in the process of doing that right now, because the government got taken over by an organized crime group, and they're directly threatening the lives of the people.
And we moved all our Russian reporters from Russia.
Naturally. So I've met with a lot of these Russian reporters in exile at Stanford, and increasingly you're having to do a lot of this work remotely from so many places: Turkey, Afghanistan,
Azerbaijan,
Russia,
Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan,
and so
El Salvador, Nicaragua.
Does being able to get records digitally compensate for that? But sometimes you need someone to go see the villa with their own eyes.
Yeah.
So how do you continue to do this kind of accountability investigations when you're in exile, because they might kill you?
We have friends of friends and other things. We sometimes hire lawyers to do that work. Mm-hmm. There are ways to get that information in country. The reporter has to stay outside the country. And as Paul said, all of these are cross-border issues. And so there's a lot. You're often, if you're looking at Russia, you're spending more time in London than you are in Moscow.
And also, interestingly enough, but in these very corrupt environments, in these very corrupt countries, so they don't just kick journalists out, they shut down databases. But because they are corrupt, there's a lot of data on sale.
Yeah, so you can go buy it.
On black market.
On the street. Yeah.
So that's a big part of our work, to kind of use that data that's handed to us by hackers, by various people. And that's
How do they approach you? How do they offer it? Is it like, like we have like this buy nothing group like on Facebook or like,
It's
how do they
email sometimes.
email?
Yeah.
Like, hey, I got something for you?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And we have a system that you can put
Link it to us.
Yeah.
Oh.
You can leave it. Sometimes they do that.
Tips,
Sometimes
like a
they-
tips box?
Right. They do it directly sometimes.
Not like a tips box at a diner, like a email, tips email.
Well,
Yeah.
it's like a Dropbox.
Dropbox, yeah.
It's actually a system that's secure and that ensures anonymity of the people who give us the data.
All right, I want to talk about hacks and leaks. Do you use hacked materials?
Absolutely.
How do you feel about that?
We don't hack anything ourselves. Okay. Our rule is we don't never pay for data. We never encourage any hacking. We don't hack ourselves or get involved in it in any way.
Well, you
shape,
just
and
said you
form.
went on the black market though, and you can buy the stuff.
We don't buy it.
Who buys it?
We actually get it from people who buy it.
Oh,
People, well, in Moscow, you could literally get every single database in the Russian government on the street. If it's on the street, you can get it from people who bought it, and some of our partner organizations do buy the data on the street with the rationale that if it's available to everybody in the public,
Right.
and the police aren't doing anything
It's
about it.
out there already,
then
it's-
okay,
right.
yeah. We're not going to hide it, but we if somebody has said, I hacked this data, then in certain cases we will take it. In certain cases we will not take it. Depends on the circumstances of the case. But because anybody who is in any of the databases would never get mentioned unless they went through a whole process of determining that it was in the public interest and that it was accurate and that we could prove it in other ways. We will use data that has been stolen from organizations and given to us. We will never encourage anybody to steal it, but this Swiss secrets that he talked about, Credit Suisse was clearly stolen by somebody in the organization and then given out because that's Swiss banking information. That's a crime in Switzerland to possess that data. The other thing that we will do is, and this is distasteful, but there are a number of people who have been blackmailed with their public information, with their private information, and that information has been sold. Or it's been distributed on the black sites around the world. So
Dark markets.
Yeah, if somebody had a hacker come in and put ransomware on their system, if it's a large public company or if it's a company of interest, we will download that stuff that they post. And then use it to look for criminal activity, stuff that is in the public interest. Because I think the public would say, I would rather know that my politician is corrupt than for you to say, oh, my ethics don't allow me to download this data and look at it. And so that's an aggressive stance, we admit, but the rule that we have is we have to tell the reader exactly how we got the data.
that's what I was going to say. What kind of transparency?
Yeah.
What's your transparency doctrine in this?
Yeah, we have to tell them exactly where we got the data and the terms of it, and so that they can judge us, and they have a right to say, I disagree with you.
And
But let me just say this, ethics and crystal clear ethics in journalism is, and I know this sounds bad, but it is the luxury of wealthy countries. In many different places around the world, the country itself is fundamentally corrupt. And in those kind of cases, they're not looking after the public interest. Mm-hmm. We are the only ones who are left looking after the public interest. And so that is one of the reasons why we do that. We would behave a little differently with U.S. data because it's a different situation.
And in many of these countries, what is considered here public records, they're not public records in those countries. So you need to use leaks, you need to use hack data. And most of the better stories are actually at the intersection of these leaks. So that's where you combine the leaks between them, and you combine company database from the US, with names of the politicians from Romania, let's say, my own country, and so on. And that's where the story is. But then sometimes it's about combining many leaks at the same time, and going against this data to find deeper stories. And many of these, a lot of this leaked information gets more value as you go in time. Because the more you understand the context of the theft, the more you understand how that leak fits with many other public or hacked data. That's where you can develop the story truly.
All right, so we've got 15 minutes left. I want to shift to integrate some of the audience questions here. There's a couple U.S. questions. Are you looking at Trump's role in this, and are you looking at Clarence Thomas?
Okay, we look at organized crime as primarily if we're not avoiding them. We don't have money in the United States to do investigative reporting. We have very little money that's dedicated in the United States. Most of our work is international. So our focus in the United States has really been trying to connect media who's doing work here to our global network. And so if somebody's working on that story, we're happy to help them. But we don't really start very many stories in the United States. It's usually stuff that has started abroad and arrives in the United States. But we'll look at we've done stories on Biden's laptop, and we've done stories on Donald Trump. So we're not against it. It's just a matter of where we're going to be most effective.
And we very often find U.S. angles to big corruption stories from Africa, from Europe, from other parts of the world. And then we connect with local media here to exploit those angles.
So someone wanted to follow up on the question about parking the money in housing and real estate, and how is there a relationship to sort of the housing shortage and
Absolutely.
Homelessness in the country? And
Absolutely.
how can local journalists who don't have the expertise that you all have actually pursue this story?
They can contact us. If they've got an offshore, they can contact us, and we're happy to work with local journalists. We're trying to get more money.
What do you mean if they have an offshore? They can't, like as the San Francisco Chronicle or like a local freelancer? What do you mean?
So if they run into and they find, okay, this is a company out of Belize, they can contact us and say, hey, you guys do international work, can you help on this?
I see.
Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. So in about 20% of the cases, we can figure out who's ultimately behind the offshore.
And also, I mean, what we can provide is the bigger picture. Mm-hmm. Because it's always not about a single case. It's a phenomenon, and that's where we can describe, from our experience, how we dealt with that type of problem, and that may benefit, journalists here in the U.S.
So where should San Francisco journalists look for some of this dirty and dark money?
So first in real estate, you definitely want to look at real estate. The other thing is there's a lot of purchases of kind of blue chip assets that are going on. You'll notice that Forbes magazine got purchased recently for $800 million, which many people said was about twice the value that should have been paid for it. And there was an American businessman and entrepreneur who bought it. The Washington Times just posted a story quoting people who had talked with a Russian kleptocrat who's very, very close to Putin, bragging at an event that he had actually bought it and describing this person as a proxy on his behalf. And that's an incredibly worrying story. And so, some of these big deals will be bought by people, but you have to look behind, are they the kind of people who would buy this? Why did they buy it? Do they have enough money to purchase it? Were they in league with other unnamed companies or with hedge funds or with offshore companies that were in the purchase agreement? So you may have to go in and source, some of these documents to figure out who's exactly involved in the deal. In most of the world, there's always a company at 20% that's in the deal. It's an offshore, and that's always the kickback to the president, every single time. And you can identify that company right away. And that's what you're kind of looking for. You're looking for somebody in the deal who shouldn't necessarily be there. And if you uncover that, then you might be able to find a case where there's a proxy situation.
And people should be looking at enablers, local enablers. Mm-hmm. I mean, I bet you here in San Francisco, there's probably a dozen lawyers who work with kleptocrats, from other parts of the world. And it's a system where everybody knows everybody, and once an oligarch buys a property here in the Bay Area, there will be other friends of his or hers coming here, to purchase through the same lawyer, through the same
How do they
accountant.
find the lawyer? What should they do?
Oh, that's
Well, say they don't
easy.
have a leak.
That's easy.
Easy?
Yeah, there's plenty of corrupt. You just
Google corrupt
you just talk to another
oligarch lawyer.
Sometimes you just Google, offshore services, San Francisco, and company formation. That's all. That's all it takes.
Your offshore registration agent will have a lawyer that they can recommend to you.
Uh-huh.
We went in once to an offshore registration agent and we said, we just got a hold of 1.5 million barrels of Nigerian crude oil, which we want to import into Europe without paying taxes. And they said, sure. We can help you. Here's how it works. And they basically had an
You
off
did a fake thing to
the
test
shelf.
it.
Yeah. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So we had they had an off-the-shelf solution. They had companies that had been registered months ago in different jurisdictions with the same name, in various jurisdictions, so that you can get confused as to where it actually is from. And they were willing to actually use their own businesses for a small percentage, that they would step in the process to move the money around and hide it. And so, and this is not unusual. Other organizations have repeated this exact same story. So,
oh, wow. There's a couple questions here about South America and Mexico and, countries there. Like, would you call Mexico a dark money state? What about Brazil and Argentina? These countries should be doing very well, but aren't. How prevalent is organized crime in South America in general?
I mean, it's very prevalent because these are places where narcotics are sourced from cocaine or fentanyl right now in Mexico. Obviously, the fentanyl comes from China, but via Mexico it enters the U.S. And these are breeding grounds for crime and corruption because of, there's a lot of local corruption. In Mexico, the president of Mexico, one of the first things he did when he became a president was to get rid of this of the police force that was investigating organized crime across the country. So he said, from now on, the army will deal with this. And that was a huge problem. Not just, there was for sure a lot of corruption inside those police forces. But guess what? All those thousands and thousands of police are going to do after they're kicked out, after they're fired. They're going to just go join organized crime. So this is why you have more killing in Mexico than you had like 5-10 years ago. So you have the same, in Brazil, you have the same in a number of countries in South America. But when you look at the business model, those people are always working either with Europeans or with people from here or with people from other parts of the world. So it's all like these transnational systems, and they slowly gain more power in the West. And they're able to, influence more politicians, sometimes locally, and then they grow and grow. We helped the LA Times this summer do an investigation into this EBT fraud, these cards, that are given with people without means. And there were groups from Mexico that were scheming, that were cloning these cards and stealing money from the poor, basically. But when you looked at the system that they developed, these people were working here with local lawyers in California, and they were big criminal cartels back in Mexico, back in Brazil. So it's really all connected. You can't talk about corruption in Mexico or Brazil without speaking about corruption here or in Europe.
And President AMLO said, famously a couple of weeks ago that there is not a crime problem in Mexico. He's overseen 100,000 dead people, in that country are missing. When you see that kind of behavior, you really have to conclude that they're not willfully ignorant of what's going on, that they're basically propagandizing their own people to make them think that there isn't a problem. And unfortunately, we have seen it is incredibly cheap to bribe state officials. Incredibly cheap. Like $5,000, $30,000 bought a member of the European Parliament for Azerbaijan. It's not expensive to buy people, unfortunately.
So how worried should we be about this phenomenon growing here in the U.S.?
It's already grown.
It's already
here.
It's here.
You just haven't seen it yet. And you know, when you start seeing odd behavior from your politicians and saying things that you know are not true, and when you see police, coming up with odd, solutions to problems, you start to wonder if there really is a problem. And there is a tremendous amount of illegal money here. Whether it's corrupting the system or not is another issue. In some places, it probably is, and those have to be identified. It's a far bigger problem than Americans realize. But the good news is that all you have to do is out it. The U.S. justice system works compared to most of the places we work. All you need to do is really out it. But American journalists need to work more on follow the money kind of journalism, and they need to really kind of dig into these issues. There's just not enough work being done in this area.
Yeah, and one of the issues is, it's not all corruption, actually. It's criminals are smart and they're very, very creative, and they can outsmart journalists, and police and everybody. So that's where you need to have this global perspective on crime to understand local crime. If you don't have that, you can't really see that these fragments of crime here and there are connected. And if you address only fragments, you don't address the issue.
Yeah, these people are audacious. They're audacious in ways, this is... if Bill Gates killed, that's what you'd have in El Chapo. These are brilliant people. They've succeeded. They've gotten to the top of their business. These are the Elon Musks and the Bill Gates. But they're just incredibly ruthless. They're complete narcissists, psychopaths, and they will kill you at a moment's notice if they think it's in their benefit. So they're really very difficult people to deal with, and it's believe me, I've sat across from them, and it's a very unnerving experience to interview these people.
And to actually give you one example, we would investigate what seemed to be this. Cases of corruption in Turkey, in Romania, in Hungary, in Austria, in a few countries. And they looked like completely separate cases. But when we analyzed the court records of each of these cases, we realized that the people behind the crime were always the same. So it's what we call the criminal angel investors. These were all-time criminals who now are in the money, and for them, the best business model is to sponsor more crime. So they sponsor younger criminals, and the return on investment is great. So then that's when you see, instead of investigating that case and that case and that case, I'd better investigate these people who are behind the system, and I'd better investigate the system, because that's where the story is really.
And the problem is now you've got this weird coalition of, the corrupt state actors like the Vladimir Putins and the MBSs and those and AMLOs, and you have libertarian billionaires, and you have organized crime, and they're all now working together to undermine law enforcement and other things, because it's all in their interest. It's in their interest to weaken democracy, because the people who benefit most from poor democracy are criminals. They love that situation. And so consequently, it's a really difficult time, because they've all been connected by these criminal service industry people, and they all have mutual interests, and that's a problem for us who care about democracy.
So we're down to our last little more than a minute, so it's a bit of a speed round here. For just quick comment on two final things. The most challenging issue you face, it sounds like it might be resources or money, but I want to know about that. And then I'm curious for all, if I have any budding journalists out there who want to work with OCCRP, what's the main skill or skills they need to do this kind of work? So biggest challenge and skills to do this work. Paul?
You take the first, I'll take the second.
Yeah.
The biggest challenge, resources and the number of investigative reporters out there. We need a lot more people to become investigators. We really need to nurture this space to actually go to meaningful citizen investigative reporting, where the journalists create the blueprint for the investigation, and the citizens are able to create on top of that and carry on the investigations. So I think that's one of the biggest problems right now. We need more resources to be able to develop first the blueprints, and then go from there to something much more meaningful.
So passion, we need reporters with passion, and that's the way to get in the door. And I look for journalists who are, obsessive compulsive, disrespect for authority, ornery and stubborn. And if I find that right person that's going to dig and not stop, that's what I'd love to hire.
Do they need to know R or anything, or coding skills?
We'll teach you that.
Okay. All right. Well, our thanks to Drew Sullivan and Paul Radu, co-founders of OCCRP, for joining us tonight at the Commonwealth Club. If you would like to support the club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit their website, www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Janine Zakaria. Thank you, and take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Janine. Thank you very much.